The first thing Margaret Reyes noticed about the man in the corner booth of the diner was not his face, it was his hands. He had wrapped both of them around a cup of coffee he had not touched, and they were trembling. Not from cold, the diner was warm, the heater rattling against the November dark outside, but from the particular exhaustion that lives in the body of someone who has not slept properly in weeks. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, now quietly, without comment. The habit of a woman who had spent 31 years as a hospice nurse learning that the things people do not say are usually the things that matter most. She had come in at 40:40 in the morning because she could not sleep and the diner on Lowell Street was the only place open, and she had ordered eggs she did not particularly want so that she would have a reason to sit somewhere that was not her empty house. She had been a widow for 14 months. She had learned the geography of early mornings the way you learn the layout of a place you never wanted to live in. The man was perhaps 38. He was wearing a delivery company polo shirt under a jacket that was too thin for the season, and over the back of the booth hung a second jacket, a different color, a different logo. The uniform of a different job. On the table beside the untouched coffee was a phone with a cracked screen, face up, and every few minutes he looked at it the way you look at something you are afraid of and then looked away. If you have ever sat in a quiet room with someone who is carrying something too heavy to name, and felt the air change around them, stay with this. Because what happened in that diner over the next 40 minutes was the kind of thing that does not announce itself. It arrives looking like nothing, a cup of coffee, a stranger, a Tuesday that was technically a Wednesday by then, and it changes the shape of more than one life. His name was Daniel Okafor, though Margaret would not learn that for another 20 minutes. What she knew first was only what the body told her, the gray under the brown of his skin, the way he had buttoned his collar wrong and not noticed. The slight forward curve of shoulders that have been carrying weight for so long that they have forgotten the shape of rest. She had seen that posture 1,000 times in the families of her patients. It was the posture of someone keeping a vigil. The waitress, a tired woman named Carol who had worked the overnight shift for 11 years, refilled his coffee without being asked, and Margaret saw her squeeze his shoulder once briefly. The way you do for someone you have watched come apart slowly over a series of nights. So he was a regular, so this was not the first 40 a.m. he had spent in that booth. Margaret was not a woman who inserted herself into other people's lives. She had spent her career at bedsides where the most important thing she could offer was sometimes just her steady presence at the edge of someone else's worst hour. She knew the difference between help that serves the helper and help that serves the helped, so she did not go to him. She did what she had learned to do over 3 decades. She waited. She made herself part of the furniture of the room, unhurried and unalarming, and she let the silence do its work. It was the phone that broke him. It buzzed once, a short, hard sound against the formica, and he picked it up and read whatever was on the screen. And Margaret watched his face do the thing faces do when a person has run entirely out of the resources required to hold themselves together. He did not cry. He put the phone down very carefully as though it might shatter further, and he pressed the heels of both shaking hands against his eyes, and he sat like that, perfectly still, and his breathing was the controlled, deliberate breathing of someone trying not to make a sound. Margaret got up. She did not rush. She crossed the diner with her own cup of coffee, and she stopped at the edge of his booth, and she said in the low, even voice she had used for 31 years, "I'm going to sit down for a minute. You don't have to talk to me." He looked up. His eyes were red and dry, past the point of tears, and he looked at her the way exhausted people look at one more thing they have to manage. But she had already sat, and she had set her coffee down, and she was not looking at him with pity, which he would have refused, or curiosity, which he would have resented. She was looking at him the way you look at someone you have already decided not to leave. "My name is Margaret," she said. I couldn't sleep either. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, because there is a particular kind of stranger to whom people will say the thing they cannot say to anyone who knows them, he said, "My daughter is sick." Her name was Amara. She was 9 years old. She had a heart condition that had a long clinical name. Daniel had learned to pronounce perfectly over 18 months the way you learn the name of the thing that is trying to take your child. And she needed a surgery that a hospital 400 miles away could perform, and the hospital in their own city could not. The surgery had a date now. That was what the phone call earlier in the week had been. The date, finally, after a year and a half of waiting lists and second opinions and a first specialist who had retired and a second who had moved. The date was in 6 weeks, and the date was the problem. Because the surgery was covered mostly, but the travel was not, and the lodging near the hospital for the recovery period was not, and the specialized follow-up care was not, and the time off work. The weeks he would not be earning was the part that had been keeping him awake in a diner booth at 40:40 in the morning for longer than he wanted to admit. He told her, in the flat, economical voice of a man who has done the arithmetic so many times it has stopped feeling like words, that he worked 3 jobs. Days he drove a delivery route. Evenings he stocked a warehouse. The overnight hours, the ones that bookended this exact booth, he drove for a rideshare app until the city went quiet. And then he sat here for 40 minutes because the diner was halfway between the end of one shift and the start of the next, and because going home to the apartment where Amara slept meant lying awake doing math he could not make work. He had a sister who watched Amara at night. He had a savings account that he described with a short, bitter sound that was not a laugh. He had a number he needed to reach in 6 weeks, and a number he actually had. And the distance between them was the kind of distance that does not close no matter how many hours a body is willing to give. She doesn't know how bad it is, he said. The money part. She thinks we're fine. She made me a card last week that said, "Don't worry, Daddy, I'm not scared." He stopped. His hands had gone still on the table. The stillness of a man who has reached the bottom of himself. She's 9. She's not supposed to be the one telling me not to be scared. Margaret listened the way she had listened at 1,000 bedsides, which is to say completely, without filling the silences. Without reaching for the easy reassurances that people offer when they cannot bear another person's pain and want it to stop for their own sake. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not know if it would be. She had learned long ago that the cheap comfort is a kind of abandonment, that telling someone their fear is unfounded when it is in fact entirely founded is just a way of leaving them alone with it. So instead she asked him questions, quiet, practical questions, the name of the hospital, the name of the surgery, the number, and he answered them, and somewhere in the answering his hands stopped shaking because there is a specific relief in being asked precise questions by someone who is clearly going to do something with the answers, even if you do not yet know what. What Daniel did not know, what he could not have known, was who he was talking to. Margaret Reyes had married a man named Thomas Reyes when she was 26, and Thomas had spent his life building something quiet and unglamorous, a regional chain of medical supply distribution. The kind of business that does not make anyone famous, but makes a great many people comfortable. He had died 14 months earlier, and he had left her a great deal more than she would ever need, and in the 14 months since. She had been moving through her empty house, unable to think of a single thing she wanted that money could buy, because the only thing she wanted was him, and he was gone. She had not touched most of it. She had a vague, guilty awareness that she was supposed to do something meaningful with it, that Thomas would have wanted that, but grief had flattened her into a person who could only manage the next 40 minutes, and the 40 minutes after that, and a diner at 40:40 in the morning. She had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for something to require her. She did not tell Daniel any of this. She would have considered it grotesque, sitting across from a man undone by exhaustion and announcing her bank balance like a magic trick. So she said only, before she left, "I'd like to meet your daughter, if that's all right. I'm a nurse. I've spent my whole life around children going through hard things. I might be useful to you." He looked at her, and the suspicion that any decent parent carries flickered across his face, the protective instinct that does not let strangers near a sick child. But Margaret had spent 31 years being looked at exactly that way by frightened families, and she knew how to hold that look steadily without flinching. Until the person on the other side of it saw that there was nothing behind her eyes but the thing she had said. "She's a good kid," he said finally. "She likes people who tell her the truth." "Then she and I will get along," Margaret said. She met Amara 4 days later. The girl was small for 9, with her father's serious eyes and a stack of library books beside her bed and a way of studying a new adult carefully before deciding whether they were worth her time. Margaret sat with her and did not talk down to her, and answered her questions about her own heart in the careful, accurate language she had used with patients her whole career, and within an hour Amara had decided. With the swift total commitment of children that Margaret was hers. It was Amara in the end who made Margaret understand what she was going to do, though Margaret had more or less already decided in the diner booth. The girl showed her a notebook in which she had been writing what she called her after list, all the things she was going to do after the surgery when her chest didn't hurt when she ran. Learn to swim properly. Go to the aquarium and see the big tank. Walk her father to work one morning instead of staying in the car. Stay up until midnight on New Year's just once. The list went on for 4 pages, written in the careful handwriting of a child who has had a great deal of time to lie still and imagine a future. Margaret read all 4 pages. Then she closed the notebook and handed it back, and she went home and did not sleep, but for the first time in 14 months, it was not grief that kept her awake. It was something she had almost forgotten the feeling of. It was purpose. She did not simply write a check. She had learned watching Thomas run his business for 40 years that the way you give something matters as much as the thing you give. That money handed over carelessly can wound a proud man as deeply as it helps him. Daniel Okafor was a man who worked 3 jobs rather than ask for help. He would not take charity. He would have refused it in the diner, would have refused it at his daughter's bedside, would have refused it right up until the date in 6 weeks, even if refusing it cost him everything. So Margaret did something better. She called the hospital 400 miles away, and she spoke to their patient financial services office in the brisk, competent voice of a woman who had spent her life in hospitals and knew exactly how they worked. She established a fund, anonymously, in the name of her late husband, the Thomas Reyes Family Care Fund, structured to cover travel and lodging and lost wages for families of pediatric surgical patients. She made it real. She made it permanent. She endowed it with an amount that made the financial services director go quiet on the phone for a moment before she found her voice again. And then she made sure that the first family it served was the Okafors, and she made sure that when the hospital called Daniel, they told him only that a fund existed, that he qualified, that everything was covered. The travel, the apartment near the hospital for the recovery, weeks, the wages he would lose. They did not tell him where the money came from. She had instructed them not to. She did not want his gratitude. She had not done it to be thanked. Daniel called her the night the hospital called him. She had given him her number. He could barely speak. He said the fund had covered everything, all of it, and that he did not understand that the timing was impossible, that he had never heard of this fund, and the hospital had been almost evasive about how it had appeared. And Margaret, who was not a good liar but was a very good keeper of necessary silences, said only that hospitals had all kinds of resources that families never heard about until they needed them, and that she was glad. And that she would come visit Amara again that week if it was all right. He did not figure it out for almost 2 months. It was Amara, in fact, who figured it out, because children watch the adults around them with an attention that adults underestimate, and she had noticed that Margaret's late husband's name was Thomas, and that the fund was named for a Thomas, and she was a smart girl who liked things that told the truth, and one afternoon she simply looked up from her after list and said, "Miss Margaret, did you pay for my surgery?" Margaret, who had sat at the bedsides of dying people and held the truth steady in her hands for 31 years, found that she could not lie to a 9-year-old who was looking at her like that. So she said, "Thomas would have wanted to. He couldn't because he's gone, so I did it for both of us." Amara was quiet for a moment, doing whatever calculation children do. Then she said, "Does my dad know?" "No," Margaret said, "and I'd like to keep it that way if you can keep a secret. Your dad is a proud man. It would be hard for him to take it if he knew it came from a person instead of a fund. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do is let someone keep their dignity." Amara considered this with great seriousness. Then she added a 5th page to her after list, and she did not show it to Margaret. And she closed the notebook with the air of a child who has just been entrusted with something important and intends to be worthy of it. The surgery happened on a Tuesday. It lasted 6 hours. Margaret sat in the waiting room with Daniel because she had asked to come and he had not refused, because somewhere in the preceding weeks she had become something to him that did not have a name yet. More than the nurse who had appeared in a diner, more than a kind stranger. They did not talk much during the 6 hours. She had learned long ago that waiting rooms do not require conversation, they require presence. She had spent her career being the steady presence in rooms where time had stopped, and she was good at it. And Daniel, who had spent 18 months being strong alone, let himself for 6 hours not be alone. The surgery worked. The surgeon came out and used careful clinical words that meant, underneath them, that Amara was going to grow up. that she would learn to swim and see the big tank at the aquarium and stay up until midnight on New Year's. Daniel put his face in his hands, the same hands Margaret had watched shake around a cup of coffee, and this time they shook for an entirely different reason. And Margaret put her arm around his shoulders and did not say anything at all because there was nothing that needed saying. He found out the truth a week later when Amara, who had kept the secret faithfully for 2 months, but who was 9 and recovering and overflowing with a future she had not been sure she would get, slipped and called the fund Miss Margaret's Fund while Daniel was in the room. And the room went quiet, and Daniel looked at Margaret, and Margaret looked back at him with the same steadiness she had brought to the diner booth, and she did not deny it. He was angry first. That was the proud man in him, the man who worked 3 jobs, the man who could not bear to be a person things were done for. He stood at the window of the recovery apartment and his back was rigid, and he said in a tight voice that he could not accept it, that it was too much, that he would find a way to pay it back even if it took the rest of his life. And Margaret let him say all of it, the way she had let him say everything in the diner. And then she told him the truth she had not told him before. She told him about Thomas. She told him about 14 months of moving through an empty house, unable to want anything. She told him that he had not taken something from her by letting her do this. He had given her something. He had given her the first morning in over a year that she had woken up with a reason to get out of bed. She told him that the money had been sitting there meaning nothing, that money that does not move through the world and do something is just a number. That Thomas had believed that, and she had forgotten it until she walked across a diner toward a man whose hands were shaking. "You think I rescued your daughter," she said. "Daniel, your daughter rescued me." "The 2 of you did. I was drowning very quietly in a way no one could see, and you needed me, and being needed is the only thing that has ever pulled me back to shore. So don't you dare pay me back. There's nothing to pay back. We're even. We were even the moment you let me sit down." He turned from the window. He was crying now openly the way he had not let himself cry in 18 months. And Margaret crossed the room and held him the way she had held a great many people through the worst and best hours of their lives. And Amara watched from the bed with the satisfied expression of a child who has known all along how a story was supposed to end. A year later, Amara Okafor learned to swim. Margaret was there at the side of the pool, no longer a stranger, no longer a nurse, but something that had grown into a word at last, which the girl had decided on herself and which Daniel had not argued with. She called her Grandma Margaret. Margaret, who had no children of her own, who had spent 31 years loving other people's children professionally and letting them go, who had buried a husband and a future in the same 14 months. Found that she had been given a family in a diner booth at 40:40 in the morning when she had stopped believing she would ever want anything again. Daniel quit 2 of his 3 jobs. The Thomas Reyes Family Care Fund served 41 families that first year, and Daniel, who knew now exactly what it felt like to be the family on the other end of that phone call, volunteered with it. Sitting with parents in waiting rooms during the 6-hour surgeries being for them what Margaret had been for him, the steady presence at the edge of the worst hour. He turned out to be remarkably good at it. He had learned from the best. Amara finished her after list, all 5 pages. The 5th page, the one she had added in secret and never shown anyone, she finally showed Margaret on the night they all stayed up until midnight on New Year's just once, the way she had always wanted to. It had only 1 line on it, in the careful handwriting of a girl who had decided to be worthy of something important. It said, "Find a way to keep Miss Margaret forever." She had. The greatest thing Thomas Reyes ever built was not the company. It was a wife who 14 months after she lost him walked across a diner toward a stranger because his hands were shaking and in doing so kept his belief alive. That money is only meaningful when it moves through the world and becomes something a child can hold. He had said that once, years ago, and never quite the same way again. But Margaret remembered it. She remembered it at 4:30 in the morning, in a warm diner against the November dark, and it saved more lives than the man who said it would ever know. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it. And if you have ever been the stranger who refused to look away, you already know why it matters.